Edwardian Era was a time of extraordinary confidence and optimism in the passenger shipping trade. There was a seemingly endless supply of immigrants and travelers alike seeking passage across the Atlantic Ocean in particular. American financier J.P. Morgan had his sights set on the lucrative transatlantic passenger trade, and he wanted to establish something like a monopoly on the Atlantic. Not long after the turn of the 20th century, J.P. Morgan's company, International Mercantile Marine, owned many shipping lines, including the famous and glamorous White Star Line, as well as a line which is less well known today, but one which has a fascinating history, the similarly named Red Star Line. The Red Star Line was a historically Belgian shipping company, which became part of J.P. Morgan's empire in 1902. Red Star retained its Belgian heritage and identity even after becoming an American-owned company, and it primarily served the Belgian transatlantic market. The company had enjoyed much success with its flagship Lapland. The 17,500 gross registered ton Lapland served the Antwerp to New York transatlantic route well, but needed more suitable running mates in order to maintain frequent service of consistent quality. So, in March of 1912, Red Star placed an order with the shipbuilding firm Harland & Wolff for a new ship of about 26,500 gross registered tons. So this new ship would be a major step in terms of size, at about 50% larger. The new ship's speed, however, would more or less match that of Lapland, a respectable but conservative 17.5 knots. The keel for Red Star's new ship was laid down in March 1913 at Harland & Wolff's Slipway No. 1 in Belfast, Ireland. She was assigned the yard number 391 and would be built alongside White Star Line's Britannic, which was yard number 433. You might wonder why the Red Star ship was number 391, despite being laid down much later than Britannic. Well, this is due to Harland & Wolff's practice of reassigning the yard numbers of cancelled ships. Red Star's new ship was immediately noteworthy because it was the first Harland & Wolff ship to be built with a cruiser stern design. Originally, it was intended to have a traditional counter stern, but the new and innovative cruiser stern offered numerous benefits. Among these was the ability to include a stern anchor, which was basically impossible with a counter stern. This would be especially useful for a ship operating in the narrow channel leading into Antwerp. In a 1914 annual report for the International Mercantile Marine Company, it was announced that Red Star Line's new ship would be named Belgenland, after the company's 1878-built auxiliary steamer of the same name. The outlook for Red Star's future was positive. In fact, the keel for another and a bigger ship for the company was laid down a year later in March 1914. But the company's ambitious plans were disrupted by the outbreak of World War I in July of that year. The third ship, which would have been named Nederland, was cancelled and the keel was removed to make room for Royal Navy ships needed for the war effort. Construction on Belgenland, however, was briefly paused. But the ship was nearly ready for launch by this time, and construction resumed shortly after the pause. The ship was ultimately launched on New Year's Eve in 1914, in the midst of war and global uncertainty. Belgenland's launch was noteworthy and timely. Not so much because of the ship itself, but rather her name, which was a tribute to Belgium, and her port of registry painted on the stern, Antwerp. Belgium's major port city, Antwerp, had fallen to the Germans only 2 months prior. But Belgenland's launch was mainly to free up her slipway and make room for new construction. Belgenland would spend the entirety of 1915 tied up in Belfast, awaiting completion, which was not a priority in the middle of a world war. Belgenland's future as a passenger liner was dubious, especially as many ships of the Red Star Line were moved to other lines of the International Mercantile Marine during the war. Work on the ship resumed more than a year and a half after her launch in March 1916. A large ship like Belgenland was needed during these trying times, not as a passenger liner, not even as a troop transport or hospital ship, but as a cargo ship. The Germans' new weapon of war, the U-boat, had been successfully blockading England. But express passenger liners like Belgenland were large enough to carry large amounts of cargo and fast enough to outrun German U-boats. So the ship was completed in June 1917, not as an ocean liner, but as a cargo ship. With only 2 funnels, minimal superstructure, and bare-bones interiors, she looked nothing like her intended design. Belgenland was premature. As designed, the ship would have been 27,000 gross registered tons. But as completed in 1917, she was only 24,500 gross registered tons. She also didn't carry her intended name, Belgenland. Instead, she was called Belgic. Having been transferred to the White Star Line, The new name fit the White Star Line naming convention, to include the suffix IC. Belgic's maiden voyage as a cargo ship began in June 1917. On her second voyage, she was sailing westward from the British Isles in a convoy with Baltic and Megantic. The 3 merchant ships were escorted by 3 American destroyers. Off the coast of Ireland, in dense fog, the German U-boat U-155 was spotted. The U-boat dove under the waves and attempted to attack Belgic, but was quickly fired upon by the destroyer USS O'Brien. While the U-boat was not damaged, the quick actions of USS O'Brien allowed Belgic and her 2 companions to escape into the open Atlantic Ocean, where their speed would protect them for the remainder of their voyages. After a year of serving as a much-needed cargo ship, Belgic was converted in 1918 to become a troop transport ship. With the entry of the United States into the war, this was where she and her peer express liners were needed most. She safely completed a few voyages in this capacity before the end of the war in November of 1918. Aided by good fortune and her completion relatively late in the war, Belgic survived the war, which did enormous damage to the European merchant shipping fleet. And less than 2 months after the armistice, International Mercantile Marine announced that Red Star would resume passenger service. But Belgic would have to wait even longer to begin her intended career as an ocean liner. The ship would continue to serve as a troop transport ship and carry troops home to the United States and Canada. In this photograph, members of the American Red Cross waved flags to welcome Belgic and the troops she carried into New York. She is being operated by White Star Line at the direction of the British government, but is painted in the Red Star Line livery, presumably to help facilitate her eventual return to the Red Star Line. By 1920, Belgic's duty of repatriating troops was complete. Still, she was under the control of the British government and was put back into service carrying U.S. war relief supplies to Britain. It was during this service when, in July 1920, a shootout occurred on board Belgic. Recently, $60,000 worth of cargo had gone missing, so detectives hired by the White Star Line and local police officers were surveilling the ship while it was docked in New York. In the early morning hours of July 2nd, crew members, firemen and greasers, were spotted carrying large bundles of goods off the ship. The detectives confronted the crew members, but the suspected thieves tossed the stolen goods overboard and then fled back onto the ship. When the crew realized that they could not escape the pursuit of the detectives and officers, a shootout commenced in the companionways of the ship. Ultimately, 12 men were arrested, and it was discovered during trial that there had been an organized crime operation which had stolen several $1 million worth of goods from ships across the International Mercantile Marine fleet. By the time Belgic was finally relinquished by the British government, Harland and Wolff did not have the capacity to carry out the large project that was completing the ship as she was originally intended. Remember, her completion was rushed, and only enough work had been done to make her suitable for service as a cargo ship during the war. Until Harland and Wolff had the capacity, the ship would have to be laid up in Belfast. She would be used for a few voyages here and there until she was finally called back to Harland and Wolff in March of 1922. In Belfast, 2 more decks of superstructure were built, a 3rd dummy funnel was added, and her comfortable interiors were fitted. Finally, the name on her hull was changed back to Belgenland, as she evolved into the ship originally intended for the Red Star Line. The port of registry painted on her stern, though, would not revert back to Antwerp. Instead, Belgenland would be registered in Liverpool. But still, Belgenland would serve on the Antwerp to New York route. She left Antwerp for her maiden voyage as an ocean liner in April 1923, a full decade after her construction first began. The end result was a well-proportioned and pretty ship. Considering she was designed in a different era, she was also quite modern looking, especially with her cruiser stern. But the era in which Belgenland was first designed was different in more than just style. In the Edwardian Era, immigration to North America, especially the United States, came in huge waves. In the post-war 1920s, however, immigration had slowed down considerably, due largely to the new limits placed on immigration by Congress. Belgenland was originally designed with 2,000 third-class berths to accommodate the large amount of westward immigration. During her long-delayed completion, the number of third-class berths was reduced to just 1,500, with the extra space being reallocated to create more second-class berths and other facilities. Even with this reduction, plus an additional reduction down to 950 third-class berths a few years later, third class was usually well under capacity on Belgenland. But having been designed for as many as 2,000 people, the third-class public spaces were disproportionately large in the new era of limited immigration. Therefore, some of the space was converted in the mid-1920s to space for a new class found aboard ocean liners, tourist class. Belgenland had all of the amenities and spaces one would expect of a late Edwardian era ocean liner. Smoke rooms, saloons, and lounges for all of the classes, a veranda cafe and palm court for the first class, a gymnasium for first and second class, a swimming pool, and so on. There was also designated space on the boat deck for deck tennis and other deck games. The boat deck was otherwise somewhat cluttered and constrictive, but the sight of a full complement of lifeboats would have helped put passengers at ease, and the promenade decks below were spacious enough. Overall, Belgenland's interiors were of high quality throughout, and on the less stuffy side. The first-class spaces were well appointed and tasteful, but not overly ornate, which I personally like. The accommodations across the classes were quite good for a ship designed in 1912. For example, if you compare Belgenland to Olympic and Titanic, which were designed only a few years earlier, Belgenland's plumbing was much more conducive to passenger comfort. Every first and second class cabin on Belgenland had running hot and cold water. On Olympic and Titanic, only first class had running water in the cabins. Second class had to make do with small tanks of water, which were filled by stewards, and the water wasn't hot. Also, a much higher portion of first class cabins on Belgenland had private bathrooms. 44 cabins in total, with each of these cabins having multiple berths. Something which could be overlooked, but would be greatly appreciated by passengers, whether they knew it or not, was the amount of ventilation and natural light on board. Unlike some of her contemporaries, Belgenland reportedly had very good ventilation and lighting. And maybe most important of all, Belgenland was, by all accounts, what is called a happy ship, meaning that the crew mostly got along, processes and systems worked seamlessly, and operations more or less felt natural. Violet Jessop, survivor of the sinking of Titanic and also Britannic, was a stewardess on Belgenland, and she attributes this happiness to the multinational crew which worked on Belgenland. And it's true, Red Star Line ships did have more multinational crew than you would expect to see on other lines. Unfortunately, Belgenland entered the passenger trade too late, and she usually crossed the Atlantic far below her full capacity, even in the summer when passenger traffic was highest. On one voyage in November 1924, Belgenland sailed with only 94 first, 181 second, and 124 third-class passengers, 399 passengers in total, on a ship which could accommodate nearly 2,100. But while immigration and transatlantic traffic in general was at a low point, demand for leisure activities and tourism were on the rise. In an attempt to put Belgenland to profitable use, Red Star Line began planning and advertising a world cruise, which would begin in December of 1924 and continue all the way through April 15, 1925. A 133-day-long cruise, which took almost 450 tourists to ports, well, all over the world. Ports of call included Havana, Honolulu, Yokohama, Singapore, and Egypt. Over the same winter, 3 other major ocean liners were on world cruises as well. Cunard Line's Franconia, Canadian Pacific's Empress of France, and Anchor Line's California. For the cruise, special arrangements were made aboard the ship, such as putting temporary swimming pools on deck and converting the veranda cafes to dance floors. The capacity of 450 passengers was not accidental, and it was not the result of limited demand. It was deemed the most efficient number of passengers for a cruise by Red Star Line. This number made it easier to bring passengers ashore in ports where the ship couldn't dock, and it allowed everyone to eat in the first-class dining saloon in one sitting. These efficiencies helped keep costs low, and Red Star Line grossed $1.5 million in fares, making the cruise a financial success for the company. Unsurprisingly, the company sent Belgenland out on several more cruises over the following 7 years. It should be noted, though, that the world cruises were carried on the backs of stewards and other crew members, who experienced a marathon of 24/7 work for up to 6 months at a time. Jessop writes that she once worked 6 months during a world cruise, followed by 2 transatlantic voyages, only to be granted a meager 11 days leave by Red Star Line. The world cruises were popular enough to be an annual affair. Belgenland would be on the New York to Antwerp run in the spring, summer, and fall, but in the winter, she would go on her world cruise. Winters on the North Atlantic are notoriously rough, and passenger traffic was typically low. It was also when wealthy people in North America and Europe wanted to escape the cold, so the timing was perfect. While part of the appeal of cruises was to escape the cold, passengers sometimes had the opposite problem when on a Belgenland cruise. The ship was built for the North Atlantic, where keeping the ship warm was the goal. When sailing in tropical regions, Belgenland could get very hot. Air conditioning aboard ships was still non-existent in the 1920s, and even uncommon in the 1930s, but passengers lived with the heat, and even tried to enjoy it. When it got too hot, they would spend as much time as they possibly could out on deck. Even those who were wealthy enough to go on a cruise in those days didn't expect air conditioning anywhere they went, let alone on a ship. Albert Einstein was a passenger on the cruise in 1930, although he was only on board for part of the cruise. He was traveling to California as part of a research visit to the California Institute of Technology, or Caltech, and decided to make a leisurely vacation out of the trip by traveling via Belgenland while she was on her world cruise. But he did spend most of his time on board working, and the stewards reportedly had to empty trash bins full with discarded scrap paper from his cabin. Einstein was also notably resistant to publicity and attention, and he figured that the cruise would provide him with a little more privacy and peace once his fellow passengers got used to having him on board. His cabin steward later said, "The professor is a man of simple tastes. He barely spoke 3 words to me throughout the voyage, but the expression of his wonderful face showed that he was pleased. Often I would knock at his door and get no answer. Then, when I entered, I saw the professor wrapped in thought. I attended to my duties in the room as he sat there, but I doubt if Professor Einstein was aware of my presence." The 1930 World Cruise isn't the only time Einstein was a passenger aboard Belgenland. In 1933, Einstein was working at Caltech when, in January of that year, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Einstein, who was German and Jewish, returned to Europe in March aboard Belgenland on a voyage from New York to Antwerp. He told reporters that he was not going back to Germany. While on board Belgenland, he learned that his house in Germany had been raided. Probably in his cabin, he wrote a letter to his son in which he confirmed that he will not be going back to Germany and possibly never again. Later, in Brussels, Einstein formally renounced his citizenship and turned his passport in to the German consulate. As the Great Depression set in, demand for cruises plummeted because not enough people could afford such an expensive vacation. Booze cruises went on for a bit longer, though. These were normally short cruises to places like Bermuda from New York. Sometimes Belgenland would even go on day cruises to nowhere because the primary purpose of these less expensive cruises was for passengers to exploit the foreign flagged ships, such as Belgenland, to escape United States prohibition on alcohol while in international waters. But this was not enough for Belgenland to be profitable year-round. Immigration numbers were still low, and tourist travel had dried up due to the Great Depression. These problems were not unique to Belgenland, but Red Star Line itself was in trouble a few years into the Depression. In December of 1934, the president of the International Mercantile Marine Company, PAS Franklin, announced that all of the ships of the Red Star Line were to be sold and the company liquidated. It was the end of Red Star Line, but Belgenland lived to see another day. The ship was transferred to Panama Pacific Line, another company owned by International Mercantile Marine. Belgenland was renamed Columbia and went on cruises to the Caribbean from New York. Columbia's first cruise in the spring of 1935 was a success, but interest sharply dropped after the first voyage. From then on, there was not enough demand for the cruises to be profitable. The ship was laid up until summer of that year. In the summer, she saw more success than in the spring, but they were still not profitable enough to justify continuing them, and the ship was again laid up. The final death knell for the former Belgenland came in the form of new regulations in the United States following the Morro Castle incident. International Mercantile Marine estimated the cost to make the upgrades necessary to meet the new regulation standards to have been about $250,000 to $500,000. In March of 1936, the once great pride of the Red Star Line was sold for scrap. This brought in $275,000 for the ailing International Mercantile Marine. Though she never achieved the fame of her White Star Line cousins, Belgenland was a beloved ship and served an interesting role in maritime history. First as a wartime workhorse, then as an Atlantic Express liner, and then as a legendary cruise ship circling the globe on glamorous world cruises. Due to World War I, Belgenland missed the heyday of Edwardian Era immigration, but Red Star Line worked with what they had, and they made their flagship a success for many years until the Great Depression ended her career.